Good morning, David.
Hi, Ron. How are you?
I have been reading a lot that the people of Israel are not particularly happy with what's going on right now, both in terms of the ceasefire and in terms of the performance of Olmert. Can you fill us in a bit?
It's pretty amazing because, when there's a war in pretty much any country, everybody rallies around the flag. But once there's a sense that the war has ended, everybody brings out the daggers. And that's certainly what's happening politically with Olmert, the prime minister of Israel. There have been editorials and all sorts of columns and the like in various leading newspapers here in Israel calling for Olmert's resignation. They're saying that Olmert, promised this striking victory against Hezbollah and vanquishing Hezbollah and making sure that Hezbollah was no longer a threat to the rest of the Western world. And instead, what we got was sort of a ceasefire at best, and that, of course, followed a day in which Hezbollah fired more than 250 rockets into northern Israel, which is far from a defeat for Hezbollah, Ron.
Yeah, and they're also distributing leaflets, apparently talking about how great they did in the war. So Hezbollah is looking at this as some kind of a military victory.
Well, there's no doubt that Hezbollah and frankly, a lot of folks around the Arab world are feeling very confident now. They're feeling like the vaunted Israeli army, which everybody thought was invincible, is less than invincible. That in fact, if you fire 4,000 rockets into northern Israel, the country will capitulate. And I think that in some sense, many people are seeing this ceasefire as really putting off the larger war for another day, that this is not the end of the battle. This is simply the end of the first battle, and that the next battle is not going to be long in coming, Ron.
Now, by that, are they talking months? Are they talking years? It's going to happen.
Look, it's fairly clear that this ceasefire is going to fall apart in and of itself because you have the UN resolution basically calls for the disarming of Hezbollah, but Hezbollah has said very frankly that they're not going to disarm, and the Lebanese government has said that they're not going to deploy their troops unless Hezbollah disarms. So it's already a chicken and egg syndrome with the Lebanese, just on the Lebanese side itself. And you have, of course, the Israeli troops on the ground in southern Lebanon, about 30,000 of them, and it's sort of stuck in the middle of all this. The Israeli troops are not likely to leave until somebody takes responsibility for Hezbollah. Now, it's hard to imagine that anybody is going to be able to be willing to disarm Hezbollah. You have the French troops coming in this international force, and you have Moroccan troops and Turkish troops and other sorts of international troops that are supposed to come in and assist the Lebanese army in this task of disarming Hezbollah. But it's a little hard to imagine that those folks are really going to take it to Hezbollah, Ron.
All right. With that in mind, though, I mean, you alluded to something that I mentioned. That is, ultimately, this UN force, this UNIFIL force, is supposed to have 15,000 people. A, do the Israeli people feel that really would sufficiently protect them in the north of Israel? And B, as you alluded to the French, I mean, you've got a lot of people who will be part of those 15,000 who really don't want to put their lives on the line for Israel.
I don't think you'll find a single person in this country that believes that the UN or the Lebanese troops or any of these foreign forces you just mentioned are actually going to lay down their lives for any of the people in Israel. There's not any confidence whatsoever in the UN. The UNIFIL forces, which have been here for years and years and years, have watched as Hezbollah has fired rockets at Israel, as the PLO fired rockets at Israel, as Hezbollah kidnapped soldiers. I mean, there have been incident after incident after incident in which either the UN was impotent or complicit in many of these attacks against the Israelis. So there aren't many civilians here who believe, Israeli civilians who believe that any of these UN or foreign forces are going to fight for them. That's why it's so hard to understand why the Israelis were willing to sign on the bottom line of this agreement, knowing that the UN is not going to be able to make its will felt in southern Lebanon.
Am I to presume then that, let's say, a Netanyahu government would never have accepted this deal?
Well, Ehud Olmert just gave a speech to the Knesset about an hour ago in which he defended this agreement, and Bibi Netanyahu, who is the opposition leader, gave a speech afterwards, and he gave a statesman-like rebuttal to Mr. Olmert in the sense that Bibi, I think, is very much positioning himself to be the prime minister again one day, perhaps sooner rather than later. And certainly Mr. Netanyahu has been saying quietly, at least since this war started, that there needs to be a much more forceful tack taken against Hezbollah. And it can't be that a terrorist group can fire 4,000 missiles at Israel and get off scot-free and continue to exist. Exactly.
I read there is also criticism on there over the fact that it initially, for the first couple of weeks, was nothing but air bombing, and instead they should have used troops on the ground, as they ultimately wound up doing. How significant is that as an issue in Israel?
There's going to be a commission of inquiry into the whole running of this war. There's going to be that's one of the questions they're going to ask. Initially, the chief of staff of the Israeli army is a former head of the Israeli Air Force, and I think he and others thought that perhaps by really bombing strategically sites throughout Lebanon, you'd be able to bring Hezbollah to its knees, or at least bring the Lebanese government to the realization that they have to take control of southern Lebanon. That, of course, didn't happen until much later, and there was clearly, as you said, a realization that you needed to send tens of thousands of Israeli forces into Lebanon. The sad thing is that 30 Israeli soldiers lost their lives over the last couple of days in going into Lebanon with the express purpose of going door to door into every Hezbollah house and every Hezbollah bunker and trying to get rid of Hezbollah as a force. The sad thing is they've been told to hold up and that they're basically going to hold their positions, and these 30 soldiers, it appears, may have given their lives for no apparent purpose.
David, in Jerusalem and in Israel as a whole, is there criticism over the fact that Israel, for all intents and purposes, has lost a bit in terms of world prestige? The image has always been, boy, if there's a problem, turn it over to Israel, it's done. Are Israelis worried about that loss of prestige, and significantly to the degree it would affect the relationship with the United States?
The Israelis, I think, are relieved and worried at the same time. Relieved because there's been a day in which no Katyusha rockets have been fired. It's already, what is it now? It's about 7:40 in the evening. So it's safe to say, I think, that there probably will be, this will be the first day in a month that there wasn't Katyusha fired into Israel. So Israelis are relieved by that. However, most thinking Israelis, I think, who assess the situation, understand how Iran is viewing this, how Syria is viewing this, how Hamas is viewing this, understand that they are viewing this very much as a victory for the Hezbollah and for other terrorist forces throughout the region. And I think they understand that Israel is vulnerable and that Israel has a soft underbelly in the sense that they're not willing to take casualties to fight terrorists, in the sense that Mr. Olmert was given a plan in which the army guaranteed that they would get rid of about 70% of Hezbollah's capability, but in so doing they would lose a few hundred Israeli soldiers' lives. And the Prime Minister was not willing to make that calculation, was not willing to take that on. In a sense, he basically said, look, we're going to postpone this war for another period of time, and that's essentially what's going to happen in the end, that this war will not have had a definitive conclusion and will simply put off the larger battle for another day.
Which leads to one last question, David, if I can, and that is, if I understand the agreement that was made, Israel does have the right to defend itself if any Hezbollah rockets go into Israel. So is the feeling there, no, Hezbollah will simply rearm and rearm and rearm until the fight another day, or there'll be some wayward ones that'll float into Israel, at which point we start all over again?
I think that there are very few people in the military establishment or in the governmental establishment that think this ceasefire is going to last more than a few days, a few weeks or so. There's already intelligence that Iran and Syria have a truckload, several truckloads of weapons right on the border between Syria and Lebanon that they're trying to get across, and they've been trying to get across for some time now. Syria was successful during the war in resupplying a lot of Katyusha rockets and anti-tank missiles and the like. So there aren't many folks throughout the Israeli political establishment that think this thing is going to last, and that's frankly why they're keeping their troops in there. They realize that there's going to be another battle at some point, but I think there's perhaps a myopic hope that this might be turning a page for the better. And frankly, I think Israel's foreign minister perhaps said it best. She volunteered that. She said, in her view, that there was no army in the world that could actually effectively disarm Hezbollah. And so this deal that Israel struck was the best deal that was possible. Now, there are many military sources that have contradicted her and said, in fact, if the IDF was actually given the go-ahead, they could have eradicated Hezbollah. They could have dealt a very harsh blow at Hezbollah. But unfortunately, according to this view at least, Mr. Olmert chose the UN route and chose the diplomatic route, which in the end left Israel with less than what it was looking for.
Actually, because of your answer, I lied. I do have one more question. You talked about the weapons that are on the border with Iran and with Syria. Was there talk in Israel, serious talk, about taking the war to those two countries?
Truth is, from the very beginning, all the Israelis were very adamant about leaving Syria out of this. Now, again, it's very hard to explain that because Israel's been pointing the finger at Syria and Iran as being the key backers of Hezbollah, which would lend one to assume that they would go after those folks who are backing Hezbollah. But they were very clear that they didn't want to open up another front. They felt like they had their hands full with Lebanon, with Gaza. They've thwarted 9 suicide bombings in the last several weeks within Israel. So they've had their hands full really with 3 fronts here, and they didn't want to open up a fourth with Syria and then perhaps even further with Iran. Now, again, ultimately there's going to be a war with Syria. There's going to be a war with Iran, and the question is, do you want to do it now or do you want to do it when Iran has nuclear weapons? The Israelis made the calculation they don't want to do it now, which implies that somehow they think they can do better when Iran is even more heavily armed.
David, superb reporting. Thanks so much for joining us.